If you're struggling with symptoms such as feeling bloated all the time, like someone just pumped your belly full of air, or you're noticing that your stool floats and looks like pellets, a feeling of fullness when you wake up in the morning or even after eating the smallest meals, or you notice that you're passing lots of gas or you're belching regularly, maybe you have pale or light gray colored stools, or maybe you've noticed that your stool just smells a lot worse than it usually does. Weight loss, fatigue, frequent low vitamin D levels. Well, if you said yes to more than 3 of those symptoms, then you might have something called fat malabsorption or pancreatic insufficiency, and possibly even something called chronic pancreatitis. Fat malabsorption is the inability to properly digest fats, and at times it can be a very, very serious problem. Fat malabsorption is not something that you want to take lightly, especially when you have weight loss. I'm Dr. Hagmeyer, and I'm the clinic director here at drhagmeyer.com, where we help patients from all over the world find natural solutions to problems such as fat malabsorption and pancreatic insufficiency using functional and lifestyle medicine. Now, if you suffer with any of these symptoms that I just mentioned, I understand this can be incredibly scary, especially if you're at the point where you're losing weight. Just last week, I had a patient who had lost approximately 70 pounds in a year's time, and then finally discovered that she had celiac disease as well as chronic pancreatitis. So in today's video, I want you to be aware of some of these things as it relates to fat malabsorption, fat maldigestion, how to test for fat malabsorption. And throughout this video series, I'll share with you steps and also supplements that are incredibly beneficial to this condition and at the same time can help improve your digestion. So I recommend that you watch this video from beginning to end, that you take notes, and that you go back and watch certain parts of this video if you feel need to be. So let's jump into this. Let me first start out just talking about fat malabsorption, fat maldigestion. There are many, many things to consider. So let me give you 10 potential reasons that you are struggling with fat maldigestion. And if you want more information on any of these, you can go back, visit my website for additional information. So what are some of the possible causes of fat malabsorption? Well, number one is, of course, this pancreatic insufficiency. Now, what happens with pancreatic insufficiency is that this happens when the pancreas fails to release an enzyme called elastase. Now, elastase helps with the breakdown of fats, helps with the breakdown of proteins, helps with carbohydrates after you eat. And in a healthy pancreas, elastase will be passed into the stool. If little or no elastase is found in your stool, it of course means that this enzyme is not working as it should. And again, this is called that pancreatic insufficiency. Pancreatic insufficiency is often a sign of chronic pancreatitis. Now, if you have never heard of pancreatitis, this is when your pancreas becomes inflamed, all right? If your pancreas stays in this constant state of inflammation, it can't heal. And over time, eventually, the gland becomes permanently damaged, leading to what we call chronic pancreatitis. This chronic pancreatitis now impacts that pancreatic elastase hormone and how you absorb nutrients. And this is why you lose weight. You get very sick. Now, another cause of fat malabsorption is going to be an inflammatory bowel disorder. This could be things like Crohn's disease. This could be ulcerative colitis. This could be celiac disease. In these cases, chances are you've already been diagnosed with an inflammatory bowel disorder. These are often autoimmune in nature, right? These diseases damage the mucosal lining of the gut, leading to poor absorption of fats. Now, another cause of fat malabsorption is liver congestion, right? The liver is an organ that makes bile, and bile acid malabsorption often occurs as a result of that. When the bile is not reabsorbed in the small intestines, this can lead to diarrhea and, of course, poor absorption because food moves through the GI tract just too quickly. SIBO and SIFO, or small intestinal fungal overgrowth, right? So SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and SIFO, of course, is small intestinal fungal overgrowth. Both of these have been shown to cause fat malabsorption. So maybe you're watching today's video and you already know that you have SIBO. Maybe you've been tested, hydrogen test, methane breath tests, and you've already tested positive. And you're noticing, and even after treatment, perhaps you're still not getting better, right? this could be one of the reasons, right? SIBO can cause the formation of secondary bile acids, which then in turn damage the lumen of the intestines. And this has been also shown to be associated in a cause of rectal cancer. Now, another cause of fat malabsorption can be to a gallbladder or a bile duct obstruction. Very often in response to fats, the gallbladder will release bile into the small intestines. Damage or inflammation to these ducts will impair that fat absorption. So that's another possible scenario. The next thing we begin to think of is things like chemotherapy or radiation. Again, these drugs are very, very toxic to the microbiome, as well as the nerves that regulate motility. It's known that these drugs, damage the intestinal mucosal lining. They affect fat malabsorption. They, of course, change the dynamics of the microbiome itself. So again, those are all, again, other reasons. And then another reason I often think about as it relates to fat malabsorption are going to be medications, right? These can be things like birth control pills. These can be things like antibiotics. Other medications that cause fat malabsorption frequently are diabetic medications, right? We know that the vast majority of people that are diabetics or pre-diabetic, they may be put on a medication called metformin. Metformin is a drug that can actually cause this fat malabsorption. There's a lot of other medications. Very often people are put on statins. These are called bile sequestrants. And lastly, of course, is a low-fat diet, believe it or not. If you're not eating fat in your diet, that's not a good thing. That can also lead to fat malabsorption. So not eating enough good fats causes fat malabsorption because the presence of fat actually stimulates bile production and it stimulates motility. So if you're not eating fat, then you're not stimulating those pathways that are necessary for motility. So those are 10 possible reasons behind your symptoms of bloating, belching, nausea, greasy, smelly, pale-colored stool, IBS. So now let me go over really what the big picture of fat malabsorption looks like, because this will begin to help you understand the digestion process as it relates to fat malabsorption and fat maldigestion. Now let's say this. You have this poorly functioning liver, and one of the 200 plus functions that your liver is designed to do, one of them so important is to produce bile. The bile is sent to the gallbladder where it's stored there, and it's released into the small intestines for the digestion of fats. The purpose of bile is to neutralize the food that was in the stomach, which is very, very acidic, as well as emulsify, right? Which essentially means to coat and layer the fats that we eat and prepare them for breakdown. So bile is very important as it plays a role in the breakdown of fats. When someone has fat malabsorption, the gallbladder fails to release bile at the right time or in the right amount. Perhaps you have gallstones or you have inflammation. Maybe there's some other kind of blockage. Maybe your pancreas is inflamed, perhaps because you don't eat enough fat, which again is normally the sign to release bile. Or perhaps there is weak vagal stimulation. We know that the vagus nerve is the major nerve involved in digestion. Now the gallbladder doesn't contract. If the gallbladder doesn't contract, it doesn't release bile, right? Now remember this, bile not only helps with the digestion, it also helps trap and remove toxins. It helps remove and kill bacteria and parasites with it. It helps remove heavy metals. It helps remove hormones from the body. So you don't want to have your gallbladder getting backed up. You want to keep those pipes and those ducts clean and flowing, so to speak, right? So remember this, a very low-fat diet is not a good thing in general because when we eat very little fat, the amount of bile that is released is reduced. And as a result, bile gets thick, it gets sluggish, it doesn't flow the way it's supposed to. And then what happens is you eat this meal, you don't properly digest your food, you get bloating, you get this constipation, and again, remember, thick and sluggish old bile fails to flow properly. And of course, with that comes a whole host of problems. All right, we mentioned the light gray colored stools. When you look at your stool, it's pellety, things like that. And of course, in some people, they can have diarrhea due to that bile acid malabsorption. So while there are many tests that should be done in order to rule in or rule out certain diseases, it's also very important to run tests that help us understand the nutritional and the lifestyle changes that need to be made. So in other words, We need to know the cause of fat malabsorption, but we also need to know what we need to do about it from a lifestyle and nutritional management perspective. So let me give you 3 most important tests that I rely on heavily when it comes to helping my patients that struggle with fat malabsorption. All right, these things help us understand what to do about this problem. Number 1 is a functional stool test. Right now, stool tests really are the number 1 way to test for fat malabsorption. Now, a functional stool test is different in that a standard stool and culture test, which is the kind of tests that most GI doctors run, is very different than a functional stool test. A functional stool test provides information on things like fat absorption, secondary bile acids, markers of inflammation, how well a person is digesting, whether or not there's an overgrowth of yeast or if there are parasites. And also, ultimately, the overall health and the robustness of the microbiome. For example, in this test, you can see that the patient has a high level of fat, high cholesterol showing up in their stool. Take a look at this test from a recent patient. You can see his levels where these enzymes that help digest fat is 185. Now, this is actually very, very low. Levels in healthy people are typically over 500. These low pancreatic elastase is a very common cause of fat malabsorption. And if this was you, this might explain at least some of the causes that are part of the diarrhea or part of the bloating or part of the fatigue, and many of the other symptoms that just simply get brushed off as, yeah, you know what, you have IBS. The nice thing about this test is that it can be done at home. It's a simple collection of your stool that gets sent to a lab. And so that's the first test that I often look at. The second test are blood tests. And the reason for blood testing is because fat malabsorption can be associated with many different diseases. Things like I mentioned earlier, things like celiac disease and Crohn's disease, things like SIBO and leaky gut. And as a result, they can lead to a variety of nutritional deficiencies. These tests measure the levels of specific vitamins and minerals and amino acids and antioxidants and essential fatty acids, things like omega-3s and omega-6s. And again, these are things that you test on just standard blood work, right? What I like about this test is that it really helps us understand where we can be specific, where we can be very targeted with the kinds of nutrients that a patient requires. Ultimately, it's going to help us maximize their healing rate because we know specifically what kind of deficiencies they have and what's concerning us. So we're not guessing about the nutrients that are needed. We actually know what those deficiencies are in the context of fat malabsorption or other malabsorption disorders. Now, if you visit my website, I will post a transcript of today's video. I'll leave a link of the different tests that I recommend to anyone who is looking to assess this nutritional status above and beyond what can be measured by standard testing. Now, the third test that I recommend is a hydrogen and methane breath test. Now, I don't always run this test, but hydrogen and methane breath testing should also be considered if a person has abdominal pain, if they have regular bloating, regular gas, regular constipation, and of course diarrhea, right? We know that SIBO not only affects intestinal motility, but it can also be a cause of fat malabsorption. And those secondary bile acids that are now being associated with colon cancer, these are very, very common in patients that have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, depending on the type and the strains of bacteria in the small intestines, some individuals with SIBO can develop. So again, the big picture here when it comes to fat malabsorption is understanding that we have multiple organs involved. We have the liver, we have the gallbladder, we have the pancreas, we have the small intestines, and sometimes even diagnostic imaging done in hospitals can miss these functional problems. And that's why many people will continue to suffer. Now, when it comes to fat malabsorption, the first step includes supporting healthy bile production and the secretion of that bile. Again, we want to think about the liver, we want to think about the stomach, we want to think about the gallbladder, we want to think about small intestines. These are the organs you want to identify as a functional problem and then support them. Now, if you or a loved one suspects fat maldigestion and you're struggling with the symptoms of that bloating, diarrhea, abdominal pain, and you can't get tested right away, let me share with you a few dietary changes that you should start implementing, as well as make some recommendations in some supplements that can also help. So tip number one is, if you've been on a low-fat diet, right, or let's say you are a vegetarian, what's so important is that you gradually increase the good fats. And now the key here is gradual. You don't want to start making drastic changes in your diet, right? If you change your diet overnight, you're only going to exacerbate a fat malabsorption problem. So you're going to take a situation that's bad and it's going to go from bad to worse, all right? So the kind of fats that you want to start incorporating into your diet include fats like grass-fed butter, ghee, which is clarified butter. You want to start consuming extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil, walnut oil, coconut oil, okay? I recommend that you avoid nuts until your digestion and your gut health improves by 80 to 90%. That's almost one of my golden rules that I tell my patients, is that until you start to have an improvement where we're at 70, 80, or 90%, don't eat any nuts. Stay away from beans and seeds. Tip number two, supplement with something like Ox Bile to improve fat malabsorption. Ox Bile, like the name implies, is bile from oxen. So you might be thinking, why am I taking, bile from an ox? Well, believe it or not, it's very similar to human bile. And so it works very, very well in assisting the body to break down those fats in the digestive tract. If you've had your gallbladder removed, then you need a permanent bile replacement to help assist your body in the digestion of fats. The next thing I recommend is that you increase your vegetables, specifically the vegetables that we refer to as bitter greens, right? Bitter greens are so important because they help stimulate digestion. Some examples include things like mustard greens, collard greens, kale, arugula, dandelion greens, right? These are all things you're probably not used to eating, right? If you check out my website, there's a lot of different juicing recipes where we incorporate these into different various juices, and so they're a little bit easier to get down. Very important that you start incorporating them though. Other vegetables that are of great necessity and great importance for the liver and gallbladder are going to be things like beets and beet greens and garlic and onion and radishes. Again, very good for the gallbladder, but like anything, if you have, let's say, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, then some of these foods would be considered FODMAPs, so you have to be careful with these, okay? Like I said, if you have SIBO, I recommend that you start a low FODMAP diet because of the connection between fat malabsorption, bile salts, and SIBO. If you're not familiar with the low FODMAP diet, this is a diet that's essentially low in carbohydrates, it's low in starches, it's low in most fruits, and of course, certain vegetables, certain vegetables and fruits, because they're high in fructose and some of these other kinds of sugars, they need to be avoided because, again, they become a food source for the bacteria. Now, if you want more information on SIBO, I've done, I don't know how many different videos. I know I've got a 10 or an 11-part video series on SIBO specifically. So if you do struggle with SIBO, I do highly encourage you to go back, watch that video. Go back to my website. There's all kinds of resources that you can find on my website. There's a free download, a free SIBO guide where in that guide I explain really what SIBO is. There's a recipe guide in there. There's tons of recipes as well. There's that 10-part video series that I just mentioned. There's just a lot of information out there for you guys if you're struggling with that. Tip number 5 is supplement with very specific enzymes that help with fat malabsorption. These are going to be things like amylase and lipase and proteases, right? These are especially important if you have a history of pancreatitis. If you have pancreatic insufficiency indicated by, again, low pancreatic elastase 1, or let's say you've had your gallbladder removed, again, these are a few supplements that I use to help in just a tremendous way. So again, if you go back and visit my website or you read through this transcript of this video, you'll find, again, some of my favorite supplements that work really nice in this area. Now, the next thing I recommend is overall just improving digestion by using hydrochloric acid. The stomach itself is designed to be very acidic, anywhere between a pH of 1 to 3. Water has a pH of 7.0 for perspective. Now, this highly acidic environment digests proteins and it helps digest fats, but it also triggers that chain reaction of digestion that I spoke about just earlier. Now, when the stomach isn't acidic enough, other digestive secretions are not signaled to be released. So it kind of has this snowball effect, right? And this brings digestion to a grinding halt. And this is how we can develop SIBO. We can develop fungal overgrowth. We can develop this yeast and H. pylori and just this host of other GI problems. So taking an enzyme specifically to aid in protein digestion can help minimize this. Now, the next thing we need to consider when addressing fat malabsorption, of course, is going to be the liver. Remember, the liver makes and conjugates the bile, and the gallbladder stores it. Now, here's where I start thinking about things like N-acetylcysteine. I think about turmeric. I think about silymarin. I think about artichoke. I think about alpha-lipoic acid, and of course, amino acids, because it's these amino acids that support phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification. And finally, when it comes to fat malabsorption, I also think about the importance of fat-soluble vitamins and essential fatty acids, right? For a variety of reasons, people with fat malabsorption become very, very deficient in those fat-soluble vitamins, as well as those omega-3s and omega-6s. The fat-soluble vitamins are vitamins A, D, E, and K. So again, if you notice that your blood work is showing low levels of vitamin D for whatever reason, start thinking about this potential for fat malabsorption. All right, so it's for this reason that I recommend supplementing with a high-quality omega-3, 6, and 9, as well as gamma-linolenic acid, as well as those fat-soluble vitamins that I just mentioned. So there you go. That should be a good review of why people feel bloated and really some of the different root causes, some things that you can do naturally, reasons behind fat malabsorption, and really how I approach fat malabsorption with the patients that I work with. I hope you liked today's video. If you did, be sure to leave a comment below. Tell me what you're struggling with. This allows us to make this information, of course, free without those annoying ads, but most importantly, it helps me spread this message of natural health and healing out to the world that we live in. If you have any questions about working with me or one of my nutritionists in my practice, whether you need help with implementing a certain diet or you want to dig deeper into the root cause of these health problems and get tested, visit my website and look for that Start Here button. Tell us a little bit about the problems that you're struggling with, what symptoms you have, what's bothering you, really how we can most help you. And what we'll do is we'll send you out an email within just a few minutes with some recommendations on where we recommend that you start.